So the last episode of this podcast was entitled Honk Baby Honk. And I think that if you have any idea what's been going on in Canada for the last little while, that doesn't really require any kind of an explanation. So there were the Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa. And while I think that some of the leaders definitely left a lot to be desired, the movement as a whole, I mean, you're looking at, thousands and thousands and thousands of people that showed up to protest in favor of, just in opposition to these mandates, these vaccine mandates and things of the like. And I definitely support the right of those people to do that. Now, before anybody jumps to any conclusions, I mean, I have had 2 doses of the vaccine. I didn't do it because of the mandates. I did it because I honestly believed then and do believe now that it was the right health decision to make. When I become eligible for a booster, I'm going to go get the booster too, because I think that it is probably the right health decision to make. Now, that being said, I don't think that it's right for the government to try to force anybody to get these vaccine shots. And that's for a reason so simple as this, is that everybody should have the freedom to decide what goes into their own bodies. That is the strongest argument in favor of legalized abortion, is that the woman's body, the woman's choice. Personally, I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that. But as a basis for the discussion, I think that's pretty sound. I think that that is very much true. A person should have the right to control their own bodies. That should not even be controversial. So even just on that basis alone, I completely support the right of the Freedom Convoy to be there in Ottawa, to be seen, to be heard by their government, to protest in the way that they're being treated in the capital. And unfortunately, there seems like there was a lot of people that live in the capital city that just could not stand to see them there. And I think that it's actually very disturbing to have any number of people that live in that city to basically be trying to tell the rest of the country that if you go to the capital city of this country, then it's basically you are there at the pleasure of the people that live there. You are there at the pleasure of people who have gone there from across the country to project power out on other people. And then when all of the people from the areas that they went there to project power out, on top of and rule over, suddenly show up to be heard, well, then suddenly it's an invasion. I scarcely see how it is possible for a Canadian citizen to invade the country, the capital of their own country. I fail to see how that is even possible. Every Canadian citizen must be a citizen in Ottawa. Because really, when you get down to it, that is the only basis of Ottawa's legitimacy as the capital city of this country. And so for a couple of weeks, that was the scene in Ottawa. You had a bunch of truckers and a bunch of other kind of, affiliated protesters that showed up to make themselves heard. And then a bunch of urban snobs, basically sitting there telling them, it's like, we don't want you here. You're not welcome to come here. You need to go home. And for their own part, the convoy protesters, they didn't put up with that. They didn't just take it. They didn't just say, oh, okay, we're not welcome in the capital, and turn around and go home. No, actually, they camped out. They bunkered down. They actually had themselves a little party. I got to say that it was like watching videos of this block party that they were having, like, honestly made me feel a little bit jealous. I kind of wish that I had figured out some way to make the time to go out there and be there myself, because that looked like a hell of a lot of fun. And interestingly enough, when you look at some of the things that these urban snobs, these kinds of, these would-be aristocrats complained about, they literally they spent a lot of time complaining about how much fun these protesters were having. It almost kind of seemed like the hot tub in particular, like the hot tub and the bouncy castles were the 2 things that these people really couldn't take. It was almost like they were just, they couldn't stand to watch the quote-unquote wrong people show up to their city and have that much fun. And there was another person that couldn't stand to see that, and that was Justin Trudeau. The same Justin Trudeau, nominally the Prime Minister of Canada, although I think there's definitely, let's just say his legitimacy as Prime Minister should be viewed, pretty dubiously, in my opinion. But the very first thing that he came out and said was that, these protesters are Nazis, they're white supremacists, they hold unacceptable views. And to me, it is a hell of a thing for a guy with Justin Trudeau's history to be positing himself to the Canadian people as if he is the arbiter and the judge of everybody else's views. I think in a proper democracy, that isn't really how this works. You're running for office, you're putting yourself forward to get people's votes. You don't really get to judge our views, we get to judge yours. And I think that in a country where everybody was being honest with themselves, Justin Trudeau would definitely not pass that test. Definitely not with his history. Probably a lot of people don't need to hear about these things, but I am going to come back to them. But he comes out and he says that that these truckers are unacceptable. Basically, he calls them a bunch of deplorables and says that he won't hear from them, he won't meet them. And pretty soon, after a couple of weeks of the Ottawa police trying to find all sorts of little shenanigans to try to get them out of there, finally, he gets fed up of being embarrassed, and he invokes the Emergencies Act so that he can basically send in the RCMP, and even it looks like the Army might have been there as backup. They had rooftop snipers, for God's sake, over a bunch of people that were there protesting peacefully. And regardless of what the opponents of the convoy say, well, I think that there's a reason why you can find that there was more violence directed at these protesters than anything that people were able to try to attribute to these protesters. I mean, yeah, okay, there was an arson claim, but that was extremely dubious. The plot holes in that, you could drive the entire Freedom Convoy through that story. Made absolutely no sense. And of course, even with the Ottawa police to be very motivated to find somebody associated with that convoy to charge for it, 2 weeks later, still no charges. No even indication that the investigation has been completed. It seems like that whole story really went nowhere. But he sends in literal jackbooted thugs, and by the way, leaked messages from the RCMP indicate that this is actually how the RCMP saw themselves. As jackbooted thugs being sent in there to break up a protest by the riffraff, because the riffraff are apparently not welcome in Ottawa. Despite the fact that you look at where most of those protesters came from, there probably wasn't anything in that city that wasn't built with materials taken from the rest of the country. There's probably not anything in Ottawa that wasn't paid for with tax dollars sent from the rest of the country. And so it's almost like, well, we're just there to provide them with the things that they need in order to build their city, in order to build their power. And then when it comes time for us to speak up, they send in the RCMP and they send in the Army to clear us out and make sure that we don't get hurt. Because for Justin Trudeau, as the Prime Minister of this country, it actually seems like it is some kind of an affront to his ego to think that he might have to sit and listen to hear out the wrong bunch of people and hear what they think and hear how they feel about the way that things are going on. And there's a lot that's really ironic about it. Well, maybe ironic is the wrong word. Maybe it's only ironic if you don't expect them, to lack self-awareness on this level. Because I think it's worthwhile to keep in mind that Justin Trudeau is this guy that from the very beginning of his political career, he's kind of tried to put himself forward and promote himself as this idea that, that he's the conscience of this country. But what kind of conscience does Justin Trudeau himself have? When they busted him cold on his blackface shenanigans back when he was still a school teacher, he actually told the media that he couldn't remember how many times that he had worn blackface, and basically he said that he had basically forgotten that he had ever worn blackface. And so the guy that wants to put himself forward and promote himself as if he's the conscience of this country, himself, is so lacking in conscience that he doesn't even spend time thinking about all of these things that he's done. All of these things that by his own words, he actually does agree are racist and transgressive. Even if you don't think that wearing blackface is racist, keep in mind that Justin Trudeau does. And yet somehow, that didn't weigh on the conscience of the man who wants to promote himself as as a prime minister of conscience, in this country. Then, of all days, for him to come out and announce that they were going to use the Emergencies Act, to crush these protesters. Of all of the days that he does this on, is he does it on Valentine's Day. The optics of that are absolutely astonishing. Because once you saw what the police actually did when they went in there to clear out those protesters, it almost kind of felt like Justin Trudeau had just subjected, the civil liberties of the entire country to a really grotesque BDSM act. I mean, in spite of the detail that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees peaceful assembly rights. And so it was entirely lawful and legal for those people to do there and to be there. And the worst thing that they could actually drum up against these people was maybe some traffic citations and some noise complaints. Which, by the way, the honking of the horns day and night, I hear so many conflicting reports on that. It's a little bit hard to tell if they actually were honking those horns all night. But if they were, that was not cool. But at the same time, they stopped doing that definitely no later than when they got the court order that made them stop doing it. Which, by the way, puts the lie to the very idea that they needed the Emergencies Act, to deal with any kind of unlawful activity. Because the worst case scenario was that any actual unlawful activity, in this case, the noise citations, was pretty much ceased immediately by court order. That was all that it took, was they just had to go get a court injunction telling them to stop blowing their horns. They definitely didn't need to send in the RCMP to ride horses over top of elderly Indigenous women. You want to talk about an image that I think should definitely live in infamy in the collective imagination of this country, for many years to come. Especially at election time. There it is, right there. Now, I'll say this much: I've never been a separatist. I've never really taken the idea very seriously. But after seeing what happened in Ottawa this past week, I kind of feel like maybe my mind has changed. Because there have been a number of polls that have come out and suggested that, that most Canadians actually supported what was done, to those people that were just there to make their voices heard, just there to express their political views, to call on their government to make some changes. And if that's true, if that many people in this country actually support, police riding a horse over top of an old lady, I think I don't want to share a country with these people any fucking more. I think that these people might have taken, somebody who was definitely a very passionate Canadian, very, very passionate about this country, very patriotic, and might have actually forced them, into this separatist camp. I've spoken with a lot of my friends, and there is this topic keeps coming up, whether I bring it up or not. And I'm not the only person to have been in that conversation and have drawn the conclusion that, if they were to put this, if we put this to a referendum tomorrow, if there was a Western separatist, referendum tomorrow, I don't think that I would have any choice but to vote yes, given what's gone on. Because we've just had a lot of people, including the Prime Minister of this country, come out and say that somebody like me, from this part of the country, somebody who disagrees with a lot of the things that this government has done, both in relation to COVID policy and other things in general, that we're not welcome in the capital city of this country that we've built. I don't think that there's any basis for national unity anymore once you tell people something like that. And you use actual police force, with no justification, use actual police force to enforce it and show people that they're not welcome in the capital city of their own country. I think we're not really a country anymore at this point.